Hello, everybody. This is Frank McNally from Public Spend Forum. It's right at the top of the hour, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and we are going to get started with our webinar today, the subject of which is our study on barriers to entry in government markets. We are doing this study with Evalua and are happy to have them as sponsors. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that study is. We're joined with a couple of my teammates, Ash Beatty, who is leading that study, but we also have two suppliers with us as well, Spence Witten and Fatima Hamdani. And so we're thrilled to have their insights as they have done work in the public sector and in government. And so we're going to be talking to them about some of their experiences with these barriers, and then encouraging you all to potentially take part in this study by participating in the survey. So it's just 1 o'clock now. We typically like to give everybody a moment or two to get settled. And while you do that, I will just make a couple of housekeeping announcements. So we would love to hear your questions today through this Zoom webinar. You can submit those through the Q&A or through the chat. Now you can access those two tools at the bottom of your screen. There's a little taskbar that'll come up at the bottom of the Zoom screen where you'll see Q&A, and you can even see the chat is already popping right now. Unisa, my colleague, has shared a little information about that, and we've already got a thank you from John Kaiser. All right, welcome, John. So again, welcome to everybody. Real quick about Public Spend Forum. We are a market intelligence and procurement innovation platform. We hope to make and envision, in fact, creating open government markets for $10 trillion worth of goods and services that's procured by governments around the world every year. We know that government procurement can be better with improved access to the suppliers in the workforce and in the industry who are creating innovative solutions. And we try to, with GovShop, one of our primary tools, make it easier for buyers to connect with and discover these suppliers out there. So I'll talk a bit about GovShop, GovShop.com. It's a market research platform, effectively, a supplier intelligence and market research platform. And it's part of our suite of tools at Public Spend Forum. And you can access GovShop right now, GovShop.com. It's there's no software to download. It's a browser-based search engine, and through it, you can find suppliers of interest, learn about what they offer, find the demographic information that you might need if you're looking for teaming partners, for example, for upcoming procurements, or if you're on the government side and you're looking to, for instance, set aside an upcoming contract for a small business. It's easy to filter by socioeconomic designations. It's also a great tool to find emerging and innovative companies. We all know that we can hire Lockheed or hire Boeing or Accenture or any of the traditional government contracting companies. We know those exist. A big part of GovShop is helping you find those non-traditional companies that have innovative solutions and may not have done much with the government to date because of some of the barriers that we're going to be discussing today. These barriers to entry, they really do preclude companies from sharing with and doing business with the government. So that's kind of what we're doing. We also have GovAirs and GovLabs, which are two tools and areas of focus where we're looking to promote innovation and sort of incubate new products and services that government may be able to take advantage of. All right, those are my introductions. You know what I'll do real quick is just skip ahead to introduce our speakers, Ash, and then I'll back 2 slides up and you can talk about the study. So I already introduced myself, Frank McNally, Director of Learning and Content Development here at Public Spend Forum. Ash, could you introduce yourself and give us a quick background, please?
Hello, everybody. This is Ash Beatty. I'm a managing partner at Public Spend Forum. I focus our internal efforts at Public Spend Forum on the research that we do, market research. I work with our government clients and suppliers on market research efforts. And I manage our overall research teams internally, and all the all the wonderful data that we see in GovShop, aligned with industries and markets of focus. That's pretty much where I play. Welcome, everyone.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Ash. We'll hear from you again here shortly. Fatima, the first guest on our newest episode of the Public Sector Heroes podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on that podcast and today.
Thank you, Frank and Ash, for all the work that Public Spend Forum does. And it's really encouraging to kind of work together to resolve some of the issues that we'll be discussing today. So I'm the co-founder and CEO at Kraus Hamdani Aerospace. We build the world's cleanest, greenest, longest endurance unmanned aerial system, which essentially doubles up as an aerial intelligence platform for persistent intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, data as a service, as well as comms and comms extension. So we've been working with various different services within the DoD for the past 4 years, and actually have come face to face with the barriers that we will be discussing today. Excited about what we're doing. We're also designing high altitude pseudo-satellite platforms, and with the mission of saving lives by bridging the gap between aerial intelligence and decision-making, starting with our warfighters and disaster recovery, wildlife anti-poaching, search and rescue, and a lot of other services that cover large areas. So looking forward to this discussion. Thank you, guys.
Phenomenal. I mean, if you want to talk about, if you think government barriers are hard to surpass, listen to the podcast episode with Fatima and what her team has done with unmanned aerial flights. I don't want to spoil it, but the record that they set a few weeks ago for continuous unmanned aerial flight is like orders of magnitude greater than the prior record. And listening to how you did that, the story that you told Raj Sharma, our founder at Public Spend Forum, the story that you told him on that podcast about how y'all did it was awesome. So
appreciate it. Yeah.
Thanks again. And then last but never least is one of my favorite people on the supplier side, Spence Witten. Spence has been a great contributor to Public Spend Forum through the years. We are thankful to have his wisdom and his humor and his I would just say kind of creative approach to being honest and authentic with his techniques for succeeding in the public sector. Spence, welcome.
Frank, I'm blushing. Thank you for that fantastic introduction. My name is Spence Witten, and until recently, when my company was acquired, I had spent the last decade plus at various small businesses supporting the federal government, but also the private sector and also the states. So I've pretty much sold goods and services to everyone. And I also have a background in cybersecurity, working on site on federal contracts. So, that it's a tough market. It is extremely frustrating. It can make you want to pull out your hair, but it's also extremely important. And this industry has given me so much over the last, decade plus. I really feel like we owe it to give back to the industry and change some of the cultures that hold, wonderful companies like Fatima back, and also some of the R&D shops I've worked at. I mean, because we can bring a whole ton to the government space. It is such an important market. And I think if we put our heads together and we're just, honest and try to have a little bit of fun with it, we can move the culture forward and really help realize some of the promises of modern technology and for modern government.
Absolutely.
Back to you, Frank.
Thank you. Yes, echo all those comments. So welcome to our speakers. Thank you for joining us. And like I said, we're going to go back real quick, back in time 2 slides, because the reason for the season, the founder of the feast here, is this barriers to entry study. And Ash, you've been leading this. This is a really, really cool work that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts. So I'm going to let you take it from here for a minute or two, or however long you need to tee up this study, and then we'll get into some of the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, Frank. And literally, this will be a minute or two. I'll provide an overview of the study and survey that we're conducting. We want the entire time, frankly, to listen to Fatima and Spence's perspectives. That's where the real value is going to be. for this webinar. But just a brief overview of the study that we're conducting. This is actually a couple of years in the making. We've been doing quite a bit of diligent research and talking to government and suppliers and framing up some of the key challenges that companies face in working with government and broadly the public sector markets. So that would cut across federal, state, county, city, as well as other organizations, broadly speaking, in the public sector, such as educational organizations, metro authorities, port authorities, et cetera. And so we're very excited to be conducting this study. The goals that we have lined up is to better understand the initial set of challenges that we framed up that companies face in working with the public sector markets. We want to take a deeper dive, and so we're gonna engage even more deeply with government and suppliers in better understanding these challenges. On the supplier side, we're conducting a pretty hefty survey. By hefty, it's hard hitting. It's very brief. It's only 5 minutes or less is what companies are telling us how long it takes. And we want to gauge which one of these challenges are more relevant, more of an issue for companies in working with the public sector broadly, including governments. What we hope to do is we hope to have thousands of companies taking the survey so that we have a rich data set that we can look at and tabulate in various ways. We can look at it in terms of company size, the industry that the companies are in, as well as what government markets or public sector markets they serve, be it federal, state, local, education, what have you. And so we're very excited to be taking our study at this stage to push it along and really develop this rich data set from companies themselves. We're also going to be conducting discussions with government leaders to understand what is working well, how to address some of these challenges, and how to achieve better outcomes for both government and companies that are innovative in their field, but face these challenges in working with government. So we're looking to pull this together in the coming months. I envision this to be an initial phase of our study. We will have a published report where we're going to be getting our arms around these challenges. We'll be sharing the survey results. We'll also be sharing what government leaders are saying works well in addressing these challenges that companies face, so that the most innovative companies can actually be working with government and supporting government missions. So we'll be putting together this report in the coming months, but I view this as the initial phase. That first report will be just one of many. We'll likely do deep dives going forward. So I would encourage companies out there, please do take the survey. It only takes 5 minutes, possibly less. So please do take the survey, and it'll add to the richness of the data that we're collecting.
Thanks, Ash. And I think that's an important point. It's not just collecting the data. We are trying to find solutions through this. And so it's a pretty big aperture and a broad undertaking, and it really only works if we get participation from the supplier community. So Yanisa has shared the link to the survey in the chat, but we'll have plenty more opportunities to provide that link to you. So no need to hop in there right now, although I won't ding you if you decide to multitask and take that survey now. I did want to mention, I don't want to leave him out, but in addition to evaluative support, we also have Professor Rob Hanfield from North Carolina State University. He is the executive director of the Supply Chain Center down there in Raleigh. So we appreciate Professor Hanfield's support of this and his expertise as well. All right, so we're gonna see our smiling faces there again. And I've got some questions, to open it up, maybe a fun one first. And I'll just either maybe get an answer from both Fatima and Spence here in whatever order you prefer. Could you tell me an example of a barrier that you recently faced? It can be anything, when you were trying to do business with the government, and then also tell me sort of what tactic or approach you think you used or will use to navigate that barrier. So I like to pick on Spence. So I'm going to have Spence go first on this.
Yeah, it's almost kind of where to start. So I think a big one on a sales leadership role, which I think is useful to understand from both sides, is just how different the rules and the approaches are for selling to the private sector versus selling to the federal government. And so one of the things that I think is kind of frustrating is that I think in a perfect world, your best provider of good or service X would be able to provide that good or service equally as well to the government as they could to the private sector. And the truth is, it just doesn't work like that. And so you often find yourself in these really weird roles, particularly as a small business, if you're trying to straddle both worlds, where you need to sort of joint train your sales and marketing team to be able to talk to federal government versus talk to the private sector. And one of the things there are, I think we're a little bit too hard on the government sometimes, right? There are definitely strengths to the government's process that we can get into, but since we're focused on the negative here on barriers to entry, it's almost like when you're trying to work with the government, you need to run this under the table, full on human intelligence campaign to gather the information you need to tailor a solution to government problems. And I don't think on the government side, I don't necessarily think they always realize exactly how much of a information disadvantage you are if you're coming from outside that agency, if you're not an incumbent there. And so they don't necessarily set up the procurement process to equip you with the information that you need to be able to tailor a product or a solution to federal needs. And on the private sector side, they don't necessarily understand the extent to which they have to gather data, sometimes often behind the scenes, to be able to get that information they need to tailor. And so I think there are a whole host of creative business development tools that we have to use to get access to that information. Sometimes it's as sneaky as trying to get a badge so you can get on site. Sometimes it's as weird as having to go out and poach a specific program manager who doesn't necessarily fit your, prototypical sales type, but at least has the contacts and the, on the ground intelligence to be able to tailor the solution. So you really have to do all these weird little creative back channels to get access to the information you need to give those solutions to the government. And the private sector is completely different. It's really refreshing to work with the private sector, at least in this regard, because they're straight up honest about what the problems are. It's like, I have this vendor, I like this about him, I don't like this about him. Here's roughly where you need to be price-wise to win my business. Here's what I expect to see moving forward. Here's kind of what my hopes and dreams are. Here's the people that can make the decision. Here's the people who can't make the decision. Give us something that works, knock our socks off, and you can do business with us. And I wish the government could figure out a way within the context of the rules to adopt that more open mindset so that more people can come to the table with solutions. Because providers just don't always have the intelligence and the information they need to do that.
That's a great point. So by background, I was a contracting officer. So I'm glad, by the way, that you mentioned government's trying and that they do some things well, and sometimes friction is necessary. But I can attest to the information disadvantage. It's odd why we would want to not provide as much information as possible to companies competing on our solicitations. You would think that would be to everyone's advantage. There are obvious rules that do keep us from doing that. Fairness comes to mind, equity, being able to provide all companies with, the fair opportunity to compete. And unfortunately, that pendulum has a tendency to swing a little bit too far towards the gagging of information. And we do encourage, contracting professionals to communicate early and often with suppliers, share information. There's ways to make sure that you do it appropriately. But not to get too far afield of our conversation, I want to continue the Q&A. And, Fatima asked Spence kind of that same question. I'm curious, is it more challenging to break through the government barriers or, build an unmanned aerial vehicle?
And Spence, I don't know which, non-government, you've probably never done a contract with JP Morgan Chase. They're worse than possibly some of the government contracts I've done. But coming back to your question, Frank, so I joke with people that while we've been building our company, one of my other full-time job has been understanding working with DoD and government. And now I can say confidently I'm not a deer in headlights, understanding various different contracting processes. So let's answer your question, which you brought up with what was one of the incidences recently that kind of is indicative of how are some of the challenges that one faces when working with DoD. We had a buyer, and I won't name the service right now. We had the buyer. We knew the money that was ready to be obligated. We needed to find a contracting vehicle. And even though this was coming from a 2-star that wanted us to ensure that we were part of the exercise that was happening, and there were strict timelines to meet up to Valiant Shield and Guam and heading out to Guam, the contracting vehicle was the challenge that took almost 7 months to find a contracting vehicle. And you know, how navigating some of that, and we had to, as a supplier, it wasn't the contracting officer or it wasn't the PM who found the contracting vehicle. Us as a supplier found the contracting vehicle, and we were able to do that because for the past 4.5 years, along with working with my operators or understanding the needs, staying ahead of the needs, making sure that I'm able to help contribute, shape some of the requirements that might be coming out. Because one of the other challenges is the users or the operators are so far removed from the actual purchasing process. And along with that, the ability to actually see, you don't know what you don't know. If you don't know that there is an unmanned aerial system that is actually flying for 24 hours, you will never ask for it. You will ask for 5 hours because that's all you know.
Right.
Or you might extend it to 6 hours, but you don't know that there is exponential growth that is happening. And then even after all of that, coming back, so networking, as Spence also mentioned, along with your buyers, your operators, or your users, navigating primes, as well as navigating middle tier acquisition processes like OTAs, IDIQs that exist, BAAs that you might be able to leverage to be able to direct and obligate the money that your customer might have. So there are a lot of different avenues that you really need to educate yourself, not just know your customer's problems and have the solution, as Smith said.
Great point. The government has its own verbiage, its own, rhetoric and processes that are pretty unique. I do want to pick up on something that you said, though, because it's a very key point. Sometimes government isn't accessing the best of what's available because they're not aware of what's available. So the unknown innovations out there never really make their way into the requirements. And that is because of the distinction between the program owner, which is the budget, the customer, who will ultimately benefit from the contracted service or solution. All they can do is really pass their requirement over to the contracting professional. That was myself. That was my role, the contracting officer. So they would pass that to me, and then I would then go and craft the solicitation. And I mean, I was a fairly competent contracting officer, so I would work with my requirements owners and my program owners to make sure that we were on the same page. But that doesn't always happen either. And sometimes requirements can just go straight out without enough communication inside and without enough market research to make sure that what we are buying for, what we're designing the requirement for, is still relevant in the industry. We have all heard the stories, especially in government IT, of not being able to update certain systems because we can't find COBOL developers, or we can't find people who worked on the first computer ever. It's true. Spence, I know that's been a sticking point for you, especially on the IT side and with some of your cyber solutions. Any comment on the unknown sort of aspect of things?
Yeah, actually, and I want to highlight something that Fatima said that you also did as well, because it's a great point, and that's that not only do federal buyers not often know what's out there, they feel kind of hamstrung, like they can't go out and learn for themselves. And so like that they're not allowed to approach vendors and ask questions. They're not allowed to go do independent research. I think that really changed. So if let's say you're an innovative small business and you have a solution to a known government problem, but your sales and marketing approach, your public communications approach is all geared towards talking to private sector organizations. A lot of that strategy depends on people finding, potential buyers finding you passively. And we spend a lot of money and a lot of time setting up our websites and working our PR engines so that potential buyers can learn about their solutions when they go out and research on their own. And a lot of times that just doesn't happen in government. So like in Fatima's case, these buyers don't know that her solution exists, and she can't trust that they're going to go out and do that independent research because A, they're not empowered to do that. Even if they were empowered, they really can't do anything about it because there are complex procurement rules that tie their hands too. So it's not like they can say, oh, hey, like I really like this vendor, I'm going to call them up and talk to them, which happens every day in the private sector. And so, that information asymmetry works both ways. And I don't know enough about the federal procurement side to talk about how to break down that barrier, because that's a huge barrier for me when federal buyers can't find or see the cool stuff we're doing because they're not empowered to, go out and find solutions on their own and bring those to the table. And if I was on the inside as a Fed, that would drive me crazy. Because like to me, when I led a sales organization, that was like #1 job responsibility was to find cool technologies or find great ideas, talk to those vendors, learn what's out there, and be able to budget for that in the future. And so to not really feel like I could do that would just, be handcuffs like crazy and a muzzle over my mouth as a leader on the inside. So it's not just the private sector that suffers from this. I mean, I feel like great federal leaders are really restricted in what they can do too.
Sven, so I'll add, everything is not from my perspective and my experience with some of this, some of the things, and I completely agree with you simultaneously, some of my experience and what I would recommend for other small businesses to do when they have innovative solutions is identify spaces and exercises that are happening. And this is so we're not even talking about the funding aspect of self-funded organization, external investors that have funded organizations, but find avenues and exercises where you can go and actually flex your muscle and demonstrate what you're building or doing or thinking. AFWorks, DIU, a lot of these organizations that have been created. So for example, SOCOM has these events that are GIFIX. That was my first ever flight almost 4 years ago in front of buyers and buyers globally, right? And they couldn't believe what they were seeing. They're like, this is impossible. And we've gotten that word impossible so many times, but then when they see it, it's a whole different. So we've leveraged these experimentation exercises to go and actually show the product. And that becomes an aha moment, because that's where I can, so we were participating in the Advanced Naval Technology exercise. Extremely expensive exercise for us to participate. We were not funded by the government to participate, but that got us our subsequent customer and our subsequent customer. So knowing first why you're going to go and demonstrate, understand the exercise and these experimentations, motivation and what they're looking to kind of demonstrate to senior leadership, DVs that come out there, dignitaries. So I had the Navy Admiral see us fly, and he's like, why can't I launch you off of my high altitude balloon and then you can station keep and give me reconnaissance for days? I'm like, exactly, sir. And that led to a whole different, so it's that aha moment and finding opportunities to create those aha moments to be in front of these customers and operators that otherwise would not be able to find you is one of the advice I would give.
That's great advice. And I mean, the initiative and the sort of the necessity of building something to demonstrate it, to get on the radar. We have a question in the chat from Mary Claire. Fatima, how long after that demonstration did it take you to actually have the customer issue a contract for you? Is there a timeline?
So that's a very interesting question. There is no linear way, as Spence had mentioned earlier. There's no linear pathway in DoD and government, right? So I had participated at GIFIX, SOCOM, where another buyer had seen me, and then we started a conversation with, hey, this is where my senior leadership is going to be. Will you be able to participate in that? Staying ahead of these BAAs that come out, or these solicitations for these exercise and experimentation. So we already had another contract with another service, and then that led to me being able to participate in one of the other exercises, and that led to another. So we were participating in a Navy exercise. That's one of the closest co-relationship I can make for you. We were in Kauai and we were at a Navy exercise where an Army officer saw us fly and couldn't believe what we were doing. So he went back to his group for Indo-PACOM and said, we need to include these guys in the multi-domain exercises that we're doing. And that's when we found another pathway and another contract from there. So it's not linear, is what I'm trying to say.
Yep. Oh yeah, it can be a choose your own adventure almost type thing where, you know, your company has done amazing things. You guys aren't, I wouldn't call you prototypical of what a contracting company might experience, but the lesson of creating and showing before you tell is definitely something that if any other company can replicate to whatever degree, they absolutely should. We're getting some great questions here, but Spence, could you maybe on a more traditional side of things, like typically what is the cycle of, you know, relationship to contract award? I mean, how long did you typically budget or expect for that to fully, you know, bloom?
So we would budget the traditional, like people say, about 18 months. And so we would budget, if we were starting from scratch with an agency we didn't know, with the understanding that we needed to hire people that could kind of worm our way on the inside, you know, we needed to start building that human intelligence operation, we would budget 2 years. And, you know, that includes, you know, onboarding folks that can, you know, help us get inside and who understand what's going on and understand the vehicles that agencies have access to. And again, that's really, and so for, you know, organizations that are looking like really, really great small companies that are looking at potentially doing the federal market, you know, that is just a mind-blowing number for them. I mean, that is not a sales cycle that, I mean, even with the JP Morgan Chases of the world, I mean, that is not a traditional sales cycle. So like in the private sector, we're used to nasty, like in the trenches contract negotiations, but the sales cycle is still really compressed up front. And so we would budget 2 years, and, you know, we would look at probably about $300,000 to $500,000 in initial break-in costs to get access to an agency to meet the various different organizations that play in that space. And so if there are any government folks on the line, like I just want, and who are looking at trying to bring in non-traditional contractors. And so despite the fact that I come from a traditional background, I am all about trying to get more non-traditional contractors into the government space, because I feel like the GovCon community in general is really stale and stagnant, and we're not bringing our A game for the federal government. So I'm all about bringing in fresh blood. The challenge is that so many of the things that we've talked about, I mean, Fatima gave essentially a dissertation level expertise on all the different steps and lingo and vehicle this and funding that. And all of this is foreign, or at least most of it is foreign to companies that aren't used to the federal space. And so we kind of have to create, you know, I don't know that the barriers are going to go away, right? Some of them are cultural. Not all of them are hard-coded into the FAR. There's, you know, a lot of misinterpretations of the FAR and what the rules actually say. But we do have to create those runways so that we clear those hurdles, so that it doesn't take a small business 2 years and $300,000, $500,000 just to be in a position to competitively compete on a procurement. That's a real problem for getting new companies into the space. And so I actually want to answer your other question though on legacy technology, because it's another big one. So, you know, when you build IT solutions that aren't standalone, which in cybersecurity space, that's what we do. I mean, we build tools that have to integrate and interoperate with other systems, because that's how we collect the data to understand what's going on from a security perspective. Well, when you're trying to bring in solutions that can integrate and interoperate with technologies that sometimes were built in the 70s and 80s, that is a huge challenge. And it's a huge part of the barrier to entry. And that's another thing that contracting officers need to think about as they're building procurement. So like, let's say, you know, you really want a, you know, innovative managed detection and response solution at a pilot level in your agency, to stick with cybersecurity. You kind of have to design that. You can't sit there and say that, you know, it's going to need to be able to ingest X amount of data from this mainframe computer that's been sitting in the basement for 30 years, because it probably can't do that. And now you've just carved out 80% of the providers who are going to look at that and be like, sorry, like we're not going to play in this space. So you really do need to be cognizant of that as you build solutions that try to attract alternative providers to the space.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I want to talk really quick. Go ahead, Fatima.
Sorry, Frank. I'm just going to add something real quick. There was something very important that Spence brought up, and I want to give just because I don't want to scare away the small businesses, because as soon as Spence, you're right, there is a cost associated in cracking open the larger contracts within government. And sometimes that timeline can span from 2 years to actually 5 years, depending on if you want to become a program of record and how some of the flow works. With the newer contracting vehicles, that cycle might be shrinking, but it's still in years, not in a single year or a few months. But you brought up the aspect of $200,000 to $300,000 for cracking open a contract. Most small businesses don't have that kind of money, right? But where it's interesting is the government budgets are distributed in 3 or 4 categories. There is the O&M, operations and management budget. There is the commercial off the shelf for hardware. There is a very interesting budget head, which is S&T or RDT&E, or so science and technology budget. And what that science and technology budget does is, so it's experimentation budget. And it's bigger than a lot of private sector companies trying to purchase your product budget. So if you are able to find the right kind of sponsors, and that's where the conversation of things like AFWorks or ONR, Office of Naval Research, or Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, or Army Futures Command. So there are asks that are out there. If you can marry some of your product development to the asks that are out there from an experimentation perspective, that some of that initial funding can come to you through that S&T budget. And I don't look at S&T budget as revenue per se, because it's not recurring, it's not something you can keep counting on, but that can actually funnel the growth you need and the survival power that you need to ensure that you finally get your production agreements and contracts, and you're able to funnel some of that budget back into getting to know the customer and the 200 to 300,000 that Spence actually mentioned. So there is a way to actually get that funded through the government to be able to work with the government.
Yes, I mean, definitely on that innovation funding, those channels are designed to invest in the innovation economy. They're designed to pump money into businesses that are doing cutting edge things. Shifting slightly to the right or to the left, just bi-directional, but just to think slightly differently, if you're just a services-based customer or contractor out there doing, typical services or selling commodities, your path might be a little bit different. I would encourage you, and we have a question from JP about, how do you even find out what the government's looking for? One way is to just read agency budgets, read agency strategic plans, figure out who's buying what you're buying. Another way, if you're just getting started, if you're a pretty brand new business that's never done a lot of work with the government, what is it that you do that your competitors don't or don't do as well? And then a great path forward sometimes can be subcontracting. If you don't have the BD budget to pursue large prime contracts, but you would like to get sort of a taste for working in the government, start to develop some past experience, find the primes that are doing the work that you would do, or the other companies that are doing the work that you would do, and approach them. Large businesses are always looking for good small businesses to incorporate on teams. If you have a socioeconomic designation, whether you're a woman-owned small business or if you're a veteran-owned small business, you can get preference in contracts. So if you qualify for those things, absolutely pursue them. They're not a panacea, but they will definitely help you. So those are some sort of just run-of-the-mill, like practical tips that you might want to pursue if you're just trying to sell services to the government or doing things that they already buy. fpds.gov, great place to look, by the way, for your upcoming opportunities. But a lot of times the business development cycle starts a lot earlier than that, and that kind of brings us back full circle to how we started this question, talking about some of the information disadvantages that come from contracting professionals being scared to talk. There is no rule against empowering contracting officers. In fact, agencies and enterprise level government agencies like the Office of Federal Procurement Policy have attempted to empower government contracting professionals to have more conversations with industry. Culturally, there is a barrier there, and it's just not happening. A lot of times, we always have to look inward as a contractor now. A lot of times, government professionals are unlikely to share a lot of information because they're worried about protests, and their fear of protests are valid. They happen. A lot of times when we don't win something that we pursue, we might be inclined to protest. I'm not saying anybody on this call has done that, but that definitely happens a lot. And that can be a real headache for government. And so when we protest too much, we kind of tend to that's a signal to government like, hey, we don't care what you decide. We're going to fight it. We're going to litigate it, and we're going to make it, miserable for you all. So that's something just to keep in mind. It's not always the fault of government, but we definitely should empower government more and have more conversations that are fruitful and relevant.
And Frank, I couldn't agree with you more. I've personally experienced this. Program management officers and PEOs and PMs that we've built relationship with, and they'll call me and say, hey, Fatima, this is what I'm thinking of doing. I mean, even when they've pursued their own, taken a year's break and gone for external and MBA or education. I mean, you have, like everything else, one thing that when we're talking through all of this, one thing that has helped us as an organization to overcome is we have to remember people buy from people. Even if it is a procurement officer, if it is a war fighter, and that relationship building, though it takes time, but that is what allows you to truly understand a space. There are times when people will approach me and ask me which service I was part of. And I'm like, I've not served the country in that way yet. But, it is that curiosity of really knowing, understanding verbiage, any industry. When you want to go and work in fintech, try not to understand how the financial services acronyms work and try to crack that industry. It's the same thing here. Build relationship, understand these terms, use these terms, and don't get, I've asked stupid questions, and I've not been worried about asking those stupid questions because that makes us also human, and somebody else wanting to help and support for you to understand that. So I've experienced all of it, the whole gamut, and I've had champions within the government that have actually, because of our rigor in being mission focused, have come across and helped and guided us constantly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm hard pressed to find a stupid question in government procurement, especially if you're asking it as not a contracting professional. So I doubt they were dumb questions at all. They were probably led to insights for you and maybe even for the folks on the other side. I want to look at real quick, the study itself has 5 areas of focus. These are sort of 5 categories of barriers that we're looking at through this study and the survey. And I think it's worth sort of going through and just highlighting some of the ones and maybe having some discussion about these. But we've talked about process a little bit. Any process that takes 18 months and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to navigate, you could say is complex, costly, and inefficient. Part of that is by design. That government wants, when they hire somebody, they want to make sure that, that they're not debarred, or, we've got this stuff going on with Huawei. So there are legitimate reasons why the process is inefficient. Swamps exist to neutralize hurricanes, and if we get rid of the swamps, we make it easy for hurricanes to come in. Maybe not a perfect metaphor, but something to consider. However, not something that we should not try to make better. The legal and regulatory environment is definitely a common culprit. However, the federal acquisition regulation is pretty malleable. I'm curious from our panelists, Are there any regulations or legal requirements that you've come up against where you're just like, you've thrown your hands up and just said, this is just untenable? Anything to share there?
You know, I'll take that one because I have a slightly controversial one. So to me, I hate with a passion the personal services exemption, right? So it is an extremely challenging, the whole reason we have these contracts that are effectively staffing contracts that the government could get so much cheaper and so much more effectively if they figured out a direct hire model that they could execute through a staffing agency, right? And they could just run these people themselves. But because of that clause, what we end up doing is we end up building these completely contrived program management processes over top of what are effectively long-term staffing contracts. And it's a whole bunch of costs, and it's a whole bunch of bureaucratic overhead, and it's a pain in the butt to manage. And we do it to give the appearance that we're not providing personal services. And that drives me crazy. Like, we have to fix that. We have to make it so that the government, for staffing contracts, can go out into the world and do that the way everybody else does that, and hire a staffing company, and not have to create this facade that this is some sort of brilliantly managed contract that's delivering, you know, fantastic, innovative services to the government. That one drives me crazy. And I think so much of our contrived industry is built around that, avoiding that appearance. And it's got to go. We got to figure that one out.
So, and what I'll add there is I'll add to the some of the frustrations as well. Contracting and the kind of billing and support systems that you need to put in the back end are ridiculous, right? And so when you're looking at the regulatory environment and how the inefficiency from the processes that exist, and why primes have almost 20% that they can charge you overhead, this is what is kind of creating a non-competitive environment, and folks are doing busy work to account for that 20% overhead that they have to earn, so to speak. And that can be the profit margin for some of the small businesses that might be coming and trying to crack open some of these components. So there, and that's where these overhead of how just to write a contract proposal. God, it took me our team a year to understand how labor categories, how different T&M money versus labor, and how they have to be billed. We work with a prime, and we provided services late last year. We didn't get paid, actually before that, and we didn't get paid for a year because of the overhead that goes in filing and reimbursement and getting invoices approved through GSA. It's just, yeah, that is what is more frustrating than any of the other things that are involved in the government.
Right.
Such a good point. So many companies give up on trying. They have to choose private sector or federal, and oftentimes they choose private sector. I think the feds oftentimes they have an attitude that, you know, they can do whatever they want because they're the federal government, they're the largest buyer on earth, and, you know, companies are going to just put up with it. And I tell you what, they're not, right? A lot of times the government gets the D and C team because of what Fatima said. The A team doesn't want to put up with it when other customers, you know, don't have these requirements. And this whole back office and accounting mess that we have to create and I don't necessarily know sometimes like what we actually have to create versus what we think we have to create. So we should probably try to clarify that at some point. But that's a huge reason why companies exit the federal market, or they have to go pure play Fed, or, you know, they just kind of give up entirely. And and we see this a lot where companies will end up, like, they'll have thriving practices in both spaces, and then they'll have to get rid of one of them because they, you know, oftentimes just because they can't meld the accounting systems together, or because there are problems with Price Reduction Act clause stuff related with their GSA schedule, which is another major nightmare that I feel like is getting worse too. But it's a big reason why the best companies stay away from the federal market, and the federal government, because they're so dependent on contracting, suffers when the best companies stay away. The government's only hurting itself on that one.
Yeah, the overhead that it does take to operate and work on those government contracts does not just go nowhere. It doesn't. It's not. You know, it's not passed on. Excuse me. So that's definitely an issue when we create processes that really don't have a real benefit. We just create cost and we make everything less efficient. So that's an area of focus for our study for sure.
It's not, it isn't just efficiency though. It is also like genuine personal and corporate liability stuff. Sometimes even rising to criminal levels when you start talking about Price Reduction Act clause. So it's not just like, it's one thing if it was just a process that companies had to optimize to implement. It's more than just that. It's more than just having to invest in an accounting tool. It's about having to stay on the right side of some extremely complicated and very scary laws. And because, companies can figure out how to optimize processes and they can figure out how to find the money to invest in the accounting system. But when you start talking about jail time for senior leaders because they screw something up, or, significant criminal penalties or, financial penalties for investors because, you messed up pricing on one proposal and ended up, overcharging the government, that's where it's like, this is real consequences for real people, not just, processes and procedure stuff. And it does scare away a lot of the best companies. It's not worth the risk.
Typically we have regulations because, a few bad actors, have created that for the rest of it. And 90% of things are running smoothly. But, there are, and I just want to, of course, we know that there are some great companies, very patriotic companies doing good work in the government because they're patriotic, they're civic minded. So we, of course, know that the government contracting field is filled with talent. And we appreciate everybody out there who does take the time to navigate these barriers. There's a lot of good chat going on right now. Something about, the latest scary 4-letter acronym in defense acquisition and then might have implications across the field, CMMC. How are we feeling about the CMMC requirements with implementation? And does anybody want to take a stab at clarifying that acronym and speaking a little bit to these cyber maturity model compliance requirements that we all might now be subject to in DoD? That's a loaded question, I know. Spence, I know you have an opinion on it. Fatima, is your company, you guys might be not quite impacted by this quite yet. I'm not sure.
Well, we have to go through cyber, even on because we carry data, we pass data back. If you remember the whole DJI fiasco, right? That came from some of the cyber, it's interesting. One thing is getting your platform production ready or your services production ready in the private sector. And then there is the whole overhead of getting it government ready or DoD ready, because there's certifications. CMMC is one of the components that's going to be added on for a similar kind of certification, that you're certified to work with the DoD, so to speak. And cyber is going to be a massive, it's not going to go away. It's just going to grow with everything that we are facing from our adversaries in terms of China and Russia, and how things are showing up when data exchanges and when more things at edge are going to be processed. Edge processing has become a reality, and with that, this becomes a reality. I understand the need for it, but the overhead on small businesses is crazy with this. So, and finding a pathway to get the government to help or subsidize some of the cost associated with conforming is a conversation that definitely needs to happen.
Definitely. Spence, any quick word on this before I tee up one of our final discussion questions for the afternoon?
Yeah, so we have to, like Fatima said, we don't have a choice, right? We have to figure this problem out. Particularly supply chain security for DoD is really critical. So I believe there's some reinventing the wheel with CMMC I didn't think had to happen. We have existing frameworks through a document called 800-171 that defense contractors were already supposed to adhere to. And so I would have preferred that we build on that framework rather than toss the baby out with that bathwater. And so I think we should be asking hard questions of DoD as to why they felt the need to create this whole other brand new, fairly complicated structure with the maturity levels. That when we had existing tools, that seems like a very government thing to do. That part is frustrating, but at the end of the day, we have to do something. And within the confines, within the mission they were given, I believe CMMC has done the best they can with what they got, the accreditation board, in terms of coming up with a workable solution that should be, make sense for companies of all sizes. But it's just something we don't have a choice. We got to figure it out.
Right. Imperfect solutions are not the province of government only. I mean, who could possibly do, much better with all the cyber threat and complexity that's out there right now? I agree with Mary Claire in the chat. It's necessary, and it's certainly not, not going to be easy to get around. So hard situation for them to be in. I'm sure they're doing this because they think it's the best thing to do. So Mary Claire and Andrea and Carol, very happy to have you all in the chat. We might have to have you all on the mic sometime in the future to have a little roundtable and hear your thoughts in real time. But okay, so the CMMC, let's consider that answered for now. And I do want to ask really quickly. I'm not going to touch Area 5 right now. It just seems to be a bit hot. But I will ask quickly about incumbent supplier advantages. That can definitely be a barrier. When a company does get a contract, they tend to sort of, almost the optioneers tend to sort of be awarded by default. Not always the case, but sometimes. Have you ever found the incumbent supplier advantage to be a real significant barrier, either Fatima or Spence?
I will definitely address that one to start with, if that's Spence, if that's okay, because in the space we are working with, we're going up against, some of the largest names out there, whether that be the Lockheeds, the Boeings, the AeroVironment, the Northrop Grumman. We're talking about unmanned aerial systems, right? And the services associated with that. Also, so kind of displacing program of record, or being able to come in and prove why you'd be able to service, be able to provide the production support that's needed. Also, what's interesting is when you're trying to, an incumbent already exists, there's processes built around their platform. So when you want to give the warfighter a new technology in their hands, they have to be trained. There has to be logistical support that has to be provided. So it's not just the barrier to entry there. It's not just you proving your product is really good. It is about all the cost that's associated in the retraining of systems, retraining of personnel, retraining of how that particular new technology is going to be purchased. So it runs so deep. And while that's why I understand why there is such an issue with displacing a current supplier, but it also puts everybody at a disadvantage massively. Mm-hmm. So, fielding or being able to truly find pathways to rapidly get something fielded so that the unknown is always scary. If you can remove that scary aspect from your users and operators, that can help with this whole process. And then simultaneously, I think, Frank, you mentioned earlier, how do you also partner with some of these current providers and then go in with them, because they've already set the processes to do the logistical support, to do training, to do other components that are ancillary to your service or your product. So there are ways of navigating it, but that is actually, I think, one of the biggest challenges.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Spence, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, the optioneer thing's a problem. I mean, I could show up to my client sites and sit there and just roll joints at my desk all day, and I'd still win my optioneer. I mean, it's gotten out of control. I mean, we really do need. It's just when we make it so hard for the government to, because really these same barriers exist for the government. I mean, we could have this survey, internally to the government too, and they'd probably be just as frustrated. I mean, they can't really buy replacements really, really easily. And so we just get default awarded optioneers, and we clean up our act in our last year of the contract, and we go after the recompete, right? Frankly, I'm one of the best at that. I win recompetes all the time. I'm pretty good at cleaning up contracts, but we shouldn't be putting the government in that position. But then on the incumbent advantage, to bring it back to that initial discussion with about information asymmetries, it is amazing how much just data and concrete knowledge I can hurl into a proposal or an oral presentation when I control the key personnel that have been working on a contract for years, and I'm actually on site. I mean, it's just so like, I mean, I've been in that position where I played that unfairness to my advantage. And I know, like, you know, even if the government hates me, like, hates me personally and, wants to see me thrown from the rooftops, when you hold my proposal up against somebody that's trying their best from the outside, I mean, it's not going to be a comparison. I mean, I'm going to have the quantitative data. I'm going to know the lingo. I'm going to know the systems backwards and forwards. And it is really, really, really hard to compete with that. And so I think my word of wisdom to any, federal folks on the line that are maybe, working to bring in new companies is that you got to have those intros to the agencies. And we also have to tolerate some, Fatima had mentioned learning lingo, and that's really important, but you're never gonna learn it all, right? And so you have to have a little bit of leniency for organizations that might speak about a thing a little bit different. Maybe they have different terms for talking about this cybersecurity compliance thing, or maybe they have different ways of thinking about, aerospace solutions, but at the end of the day, it's the same. And so we have to have I encourage a little bit of leniency and tolerance for companies that are trying to get up that learning curve as they learn your agency. And, you can help them understand just, the basics of your agency without violating procurement rules. Because when you don't have that, it really is hard to compete against incumbents because they just have that data on lockdown. And again, I have used that to my advantage to win recompetes I shouldn't have won, where the client really didn't like us and wanted us gone, but just, I can put the fear of God in them that if they get rid of me, they're going to lose all that knowledge. And I don't like being in that position with my clients, but I've done it and I've won, and it really shouldn't be that way.
Precisely. I mean, the incumbent advantage exists also because transition costs are significant. I mean, we talk about how hard it is to win contracts in the government. Speaking from experience, and I've competed for contracts as a private contractor, but I've also written them and solicited them inside. And that's no easy day. That takes a lot of time and effort and blood, sweat, and tears. So the fact that you have an incumbent, you're not just, if you're on the outside trying to unseat that incumbent, you're not just competing against the incumbent and trying to demonstrate that you're better than they. You're also competing against that transition, the cost of bringing a new contractor on. If you think it's expensive to replace an employee, think about replacing an entire contractor. I don't like to change cable providers, much less change a whole incumbent contract. That's a legitimate thing, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. We got to have the catfish out there nipping at the toes and making government want to reevaluate what they're doing. So we all have responsibility in this. Everybody has skin in the game, whether or not you're on the government side or on the private side. Ultimately, we're working for the taxpayer, and that's all of us. So these are, look, this has been an incredible conversation. I think we had budgeted to 2:30, but we've gotten most of what we sort of wanted to accomplish done. And, the questions have been awesome. The discourse has been phenomenal and entertaining and lively. So I want to thank Fatima and Spence for hopping on with us. You guys are the best. And we're definitely gonna have to do this again. I can tell there's some folks in the chat that are just gnawing at the bit to get through and have this with us. So maybe we can do it again. In the interim, we have a very special offer. If you complete our survey, you'll be entered to win that's not a typo. I clarified. That's a $500 Amazon gift card and a free GovShop Accelerator subscription for 6 months. That's like another $120 value. So $600 plus on the line just for taking a 5-minute survey. And there's that link again. Thanks, Yanisa, for putting that in the chat. So please consider that. Share it with your friends. We really do want to make a difference here, and it starts with getting input from folks like yourself. So share this survey link and give yourself a chance at this gift card. And you could get it in time for the shopping season. It's going to be a busy e-commerce season, I'm understanding, this fourth quarter. So final thoughts from anyone on the panel? I'll pause for a second. Feel free to have some closing words here.
I mean, I'll first thank you, Public Spend Forum, for what you guys are doing and how hard you guys are working. And it might seem an uphill battle, but finding the right kind of partners, knowing that you can share and move the needle, who are your champions, how do you use, we started working with DIUX 5 years ago or so, 4.5 years ago, when they still had the X. They didn't have any of their own budgets, but they were great for introductions, so while there are all of these challenges, it's like you said earlier, Frank, this is all of our taxpayer money. It's our warfighters that are out there, and having that focus on mission allows you to get up every morning and want to, fight this fight, so to speak.
Great. Thank you. Spence, anything to take us out?
Yeah, take the survey. It's a brilliantly designed survey. It is like really easy to take. It was super streamlined, but still manages to be comprehensive. And, I thought it was one of the best designed surveys I'd seen. It's not like one of those ones where you open up and you've just, lost 30 minutes of your life and then you give up at the end because it's just too long. So they did Public Spend Forum did a wonderful job of putting it together. So please dive in and take the survey.
Well, now Ash is blushing. Thank you, Spence. All right. Well, it sounded like there was a lot of talk about getting into government too. I want to just as a reminder for myself, but Unisa, can you help us remember? Let's share the link to some of our How to Win in Government Contracts content that we've produced earlier this year. Maybe that would be a useful thing to send out in the post-event email. But for now, I'm going to adjourn. Let you all have some time back. And thanks for your time today. We really appreciate you spending the time with us, and go do the survey, and we'll be back with some more great content on barriers to entry in the near future. So stay tuned. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Bye now.